Welcome to Live with the League. I'm Emily Kalashevsky, the Assistant Director of Member Experience and Learning here. And we've got a full show lined up for you today with updates from our state and federal affairs team. We'll be discussing progress on the oath of office legislation and an update on the Dark Store Prevention Act, recent member engagement events hosted in partnership with SEMCOG, housing policy developments and legislative activity, the latest on the state budget process, including personal property tax reimbursement and housing priorities, and video franchise fee legislation and its potential impact on local governments. If you're watching live, feel free to drop your questions in the chat or Q&A box, and we'll answer as many as we can throughout the show. Let's get right into it. John, let's start off with some good news. The League has been working on legislation to address oath of office timing issues that emerged after Proposal 2, and it sounds like we are finally nearing the finish line. Remind us what problem communities we're facing here with this.
Yeah. So when Proposal 2 passed, there was an issue. And actually, I was just sitting with some city managers the other day who asked about this. It's like, what happens if before I can count all the ballots that come in late based on, I shouldn't say late, but that come in after the election day, but I'm still legally allowed to count. What happens if my charter says we need to sit a newly elected member of our council before that? So we have been working on some legislation to make sure that consistently across the board, we have a clear date by which, if there is that conflict, which is now December 1st, we can go ahead and do that. So there were four bills that were in play. Those four bills have sat there, not just for a portion of this year, but sat there in lame duck last session. And the excuse was, well, these bills will be easy to get done, so we'll go and do them right away. And so finally, about 18 months later, they have been sent to the governor's desk. We fully anticipate that she will sign them. There have been no issues. They passed the Senate 36-1 and the House near unanimous as well. So good news for those looking for clarity, not just on how we work through Proposal 2 and make sure that we get those ballots counted as they may come in after Election Day, but that we can sit our elected officials appropriately at any point in time based on that count.
So sounds like we talked about, resolution finally coming from that.
One of the few this year. I think those four bills will account for about 20% of all signed bills once they're said and done right now for 2026. But there's actually going to be probably a number of bills being sent to the governor here over the next couple of weeks, potentially. So we'll see.
All right. Well, John, Dave also testified recently in support of legislation known as the Dark Store Prevention Act. What problem is this bill, Senate Bill 960, attempting to address?
Yeah, so we've talked about the issue of dark stores for a long time. And for those of you that
Mhm.
aren't familiar with dark stores, we often refer to it as sort of the big box issue. So you have a big box store. I won't name any names because I don't want to play favorites or pick on people, but you have a big box store that is no longer in business. Or what they will do is they will attempt to have their property reassessed if that building is actually active and have the comparable be a vacant big box store. And so as a result, what we see is a declining tax base in those particular cases. And it's an issue that we've worked to correct for several years, actually going all the way back to an individual by the name of Dave Matern about 4 sessions ago was the first one to try to help us with this. And now this Dark Store Prevention Act doesn't get the full fix that we've advocated for, but what it really does get is at deed restrictions. So we know several of these facilities will put deed restrictions on their property. Those will then prevent that property to be sold for maybe a valuable use that could turn that property back to the tax rolls. And so what we've come up with in conjunction with Senator Veronica Kleinfeld is to, if there's a deed restriction in place and that property is to become blighted, then we can seek action to then remove that deed restriction and then try to get that back in the hands of another entity that could renovate it, put it back into reuse, and then make sure that that's back on the tax rolls in a productive way. So again, chipping away at the problem, I would say, but it's a positive step forward. Whether or not it has an opportunity to get done this year is still up for debate, but it's an issue that we're going to continue to work on, whether it be this session or into next session.
And I think that's the next question that I have is in terms of the bill's prospects moving forward. Obviously, this is an issue that's come up over the years. And so, do you have any sense of whether this will get done in this session, or if you do think it's something that will come up again in next
Yeah.
session?
Yeah, very hard to make predictions based on what's going on right now, and probably talk about some of that as we get into the budget updates and those things that are going on today. I
Sure.
think we're hopeful that we're going to see it come out of the Senate. I think the chances of it happening in the House are not necessarily as high as they are in the Senate. That doesn't mean we won't find an opportunity, maybe to negotiate on that in conjunction with some other things as we talk about property tax reform and stuff like that. And so I don't want to say, hey, it's going to happen this year. We're going to have to put it off to next year. I think what we're going to do is look for avenues of opportunity to find success on this issue and take advantage of those whenever we can.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. All right, Jen, let's turn to you for a moment. You've been spending a lot of time connecting directly with local officials and legislators around the state. And one of the things we know the league does best is create those opportunities for officials and legislators to connect directly with one another, learn from one another, et cetera. An example of that is you recently participated in a SEMCOG Lunch and Learn that brought together those groups of folks. Tell us a little bit about that event.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Uh, Not last week, but the week before, we gathered down in SEMCOG's offices in Detroit, working with Scott Benson from the Detroit City Council in hosting a lunch and learn. What we've really found out when it comes to housing and the housing preemption bills is that there is a lack of knowledge of what those bills actually do and don't do, depending on who you're talking to. And so, as we have been trying to really set the record straight, as in what it does, the bill's language says, how that, impacts communities on the ground. And that's really what that lunch and learn was about. We had a handful of legislators who showed up, and then we had probably double that in legislative staff who participated. There was a lot of good discussions and Q&A, and I think a lot of people left with a lot more knowledge of, oh, this is the impact that could have versus maybe what they thought just from, listening to others talk about it versus digging into it. There were some great examples from some of the communities that participated, especially in walking through the infrastructure constraints.
Mm,
So we had someone from SEMCOG that was explaining the infrastructure impacts, and then we had a municipality sitting there saying, "In my community, that means X, Y, Z." And I really think that helped people visualize and really see that those bills are not going to do what the proponents of them are trying to say they're going to do.
And I think that highlights why these conversations are so important from an advocacy perspective. I think, internally here at the league, our members have certainly been hearing about this legislation and at this point might be able to parrot some of the talking points that we have been getting out there for months and months and months. But there's still a lot of education that needs to be done. And we can't assume that everybody knows in the same way that our communities know. So, what, aside from some of those examples, are there any other takeaways from that event that you thought were striking?
Well, I think the other thing we were able to highlight at that event, and then even last week's event, was the My Home program. And
Mhm.
being able to show here is some legislation that is still working on zoning reform, but allowing for that community context, as well as really getting at what the issue is the cost. And how do
Mhm.
we get from what it costs to build it, whether it's an ADU, it's a 500 square foot dwelling, or it's a single family home that's 3,000 square feet, is how do we get from the cost of that to someone that can be able to afford or rent it, whether it's rent or buy it. So we were
Right.
able to also have some really good discussions around the differences between and what the results could be.
Mm. Well, you mentioned that there was another event. You recently also participated in a SEMCOG University event. So, can you tell us a little bit about the focus of that program?
Yeah, so last week, working with SEMCOG, and then we also had some of our labs and policy team there, Murph gave a great presentation and that was mostly communities in the room, heavily Southeast Michigan, because again, we were in SEMCOG's Detroit office and really highlighting what communities are already doing. But we started off by SEMCOG staff setting the stage of kind of where we're at. And then Murph gave a great presentation on all of the different tools and resources and guides that the league has been working on, over the last decade plus, and how
Hmm.
communities are using those, how folks can use those. There was a private planner that works with many communities in Southeast Michigan that was on the panel to talk as well. And he even at the end commented how he wasn't even aware of all of the things that we have been doing with our members. And so, even just the awareness now that he and now that firm will have, and being able to work with their clients who are our members on those things, I think was so beneficial. But that really highlighted after we did the resources and the different tools, then we transitioned into spotlighting municipalities and how they were helping and how they were updating their zoning. We had from Dearborn and Sterling Heights to Pittsfield Township and Dexter. So we tried to show a range of municipalities and what they were doing. And a lot of it came back down again to zoning not being the issue, the cost constraints and the labor
Hmm.
constraints being the issues of what was lacking to drive these projects forward. So it was a good where municipalities were able to share and learn from each other. After the presentations were done, there was a guided discussion. SEMCOG has been doing great at gathering certain data points. And so there was conversation around, is there data out there we're not looking at? And one thing that
Sure.
came up through those conversations was about the cost of rehab, just, your
Hmm.
average person wanting to update and maintain their existing housing. And so I think a lot of good follow up came, but just even connecting those members to talk about what they had done and how others could learn and share was again a great experiencing and great time spent for league staff working with SEMCOG.
Absolutely. Well, and I think the theme of all of what we've just been talking about remains housing, which has been the main topic of conversation here at the League for months. So when we talk about that specific legislation, Jen, what can you tell us? What's the latest there?
Yeah, so there has not been any other hearings thus far. The league put out a statement, and I think John is going to talk about this, but really asking the governor and the legislature to not make this part of budget negotiations.
Mhm.
That this is an important topic, and it needs the time and attention not to be wrapped up as the sidecar to the budget somehow. And so I can tell you, I am spending, in fact, I hopped on this right as we were going live because I had another meeting with a legislator. I am spending a lot of time with legislators and legislative staff right now, talking through the bills, talking about the My Home program, you know, trying to gauge what the future may hold. And we cannot let up. And again, to going back to the event last week, one of the most important things is having our members tell their legislators the story.
Mhm.
What have they already updated? What are they in the process of doing? And if the preemption bills were to pass, what does that mean in their community? What does that mean for that legislator's district? And so telling those stories of what's being done and what would happen is critical as we keep moving forward here, because this isn't going away. Even if we make it
Right.
through the next couple of weeks with hopefully the budget gets done on time, we're still going to have later this fall and ultimately lame duck. And so it's not something that's going away, and we just got to keep that conversation moving forward in our direction.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jen. Before I get into a couple of other topics with John, I know I've got a couple of questions that have come in through the chat that I think are ones you handle. So first, is there any update on when the Commercial Rehabilitation Act will get voted on and what direction is that going?
Yeah, so still, I mean, the last meeting I just had, it was mentioned. I talked to House policy staff, House Republican policy staff last week. The Something's going to happen. I don't know when. Right now, everyone is focused on the budget. And so
Mhm.
we have to at least get through the budget. I do believe that it will get reauthorized. I just don't know if that's going to be in 2 weeks. Most likely not. It's more going to be closer to the end of the year. And we're also working on the obsolete property rehabilitation acts because PA 146 sunsets at the end of this year, and we do not want to be in the same situation with that. So all I can say is keep reaching out to your legislators and letting them know about projects that are falling off because you can't grant certificates for PA 210 or 255, and how that is a local tool, a local abatement tool where you get to make the decisions and helps you with economic development. Some of those projects help with housing and really pushing that. That's sitting right there for the House to act on. And they really could move that needle forward. They could push that forward to help locals with housing projects. And until then, you're just sitting there. But they need to hear about the negative impacts that are happening, not having that reauthorized already. So keep talking about the projects. Let the sponsor's office know that's Representative Van Workum is the lead in the House on 5305 and 5306. And so hopefully, that push and that effort will get us here once the budget's done into really trying to focus on them getting that out of the house and across the finish line.
Thanks, Jen. One more question for you. Has there been any movement on state legislation for backyard chickens? That's House Bill 4049.
Yeah, so it's been introduced. There has not been any active movement on it. Again, that bill is live until this session is over, and so we'll continue to monitor that. But there are not any active conversations going on in big pushes for that to move at this time.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate all the work you're doing. All right, John, let's turn to another large issue currently being debated in Lansing. The budget process has been getting a lot of attention lately. We've been talking about it a lot. Where do those budget negotiations currently stand?
I'm half tempted to go back to what Jen just said, which is there are no active conversations taking place and not a big push at this time, but I don't think it's quite that bad.
Mm,
But it has been like it was last session, a challenge at times. Now,
mhm,
all that being said, I do think there is some good news in the last couple of days is legislators and in particular the principals, the speaker, the Senate Majority Leader, and the governor. I believe, and I don't necessarily believe all the headlines, but if you sort of believe what we hear behind the scenes, are starting to have more direct conversations. There's always an important word we mention, which is called targets, which is the
mhm.
budget target numbers that each subcommittee chair is given to help build each component of the budget for each individual department. I do think that those are very, very close to being given to those subcommittee chairs. They haven't been delivered yet based on the knowledge we have of the situation, but I think they're close. Once those are delivered, that puts us on a much faster track to get things done. The question of whether or not we can get this all signed, sealed, and delivered by July 1, I think that's going to be awful tight.
Mhm,
Told somebody earlier, I think July 2nd is a little bit more realistic, maybe just slightly greater than 50% right now, if I had to take a guess. But a lot changes, sort of, minute to minute, hour to hour right now. And there are things in the budget process that are very good and
mhm.
have the ability for us to see some real headway on a couple of key things, including the revenue sharing trust fund. But as Jen had mentioned, if you talk about things that do worry us at times in our spaces as other policy issues get attached to this. And that happens in every budget. I don't want to pretend like
Sure.
it doesn't happen. But when you have two major policy issues like housing and property tax reform that sit out there, which is why to Jen's point earlier, we put out a statement asking the governor and the legislature not to attach these two issues to the budget. If you think about the complexity of those and the downstream impacts and effects, not just on local government, but across the board, trying to figure out policy that works in a 8 or 9 day condensed time frame would be darn near impossible.
Mhm.
And those are the types of things that we want to avoid. Not that we're unwilling to have the conversation. We have always been willing to have that conversation, but so we don't get wrapped up in big unintended consequences. And I'll utilize that to sort of almost transition to maybe the next question you're going to ask me, Emily, which is about, receipts for road funding, right?
Mhm.
And the reason I bring that up is because that was a deal that was cut at the very last moment. Policy bills were quickly put together and adjusted and changed. And what we see now is some of the implementation of that, not that it is necessarily bad per se, right? But it's different. So it changes the way and when money comes into communities. That was not necessarily anticipated at the table, I think, in the same way of which it's played out. The other thing is then you attached it to a brand new revenue source, in this case, a marijuana wholesale tax, which in the first quarter, resources did not meet sort of the expectation or the projection of which maybe some were hoping for. I will say this though about that. I have asked Treasury very directly, do you have concerns? And to date, they do not, right? I think
Mm.
some of the first quarter um, returns that we saw, them being lower than maybe 25% of the total pot, were to be expected based on people pre-buying, prior to this going into effect and a few other factors. Now, again, does it get there? I'm not going to say it will or it won't. But I will say this, I tend not to trust the industry in terms of them saying this is a major problem. And I'll look more to our friends at Treasury right now to say, what are you really seeing on the back end? Do your projections still hold? And as of now, they are, in their opinion. I think still, again, we'll see what happens. But for those that we listen to and those that we trust, currently right now, those projections are expected to meet the targets.
And I want to transition to personal property tax reimbursement. What's the latest with that?
In terms of the blog we just put out, that one, yeah, I'd love to talk about that because there was an expansion of the small taxpayer exemption a couple of years ago. And this
Mhm.
was a big worry for us, quite frankly, at the time, and had been for a couple of years because it expanded the small taxpayer exemption from 80,000 to 180,000. And that expansion at the time when we did it, not knowing how great the cost was, we set aside $75 million to hold local governments harmless. Fortunately, that money has continued to remain in the budget and is in the budget again this year as of, kind of negotiations really finalizing here in the last couple of weeks. Uh, we don't see that to be in jeopardy though. And so just recently, Treasury put out a memo about the next round of reimbursements for that, making sure that people have access to that information, understand when the money is going to be delivered. And we posted a blog on it. So as much heartburn as there was, sort of cutting that deal right away and having to address some of the things that happened in a lame duck scenario, which is really what happened here, we found a way to manage that, make sure the reimbursement continues to come through.
And let's talk about housing funding. It's another key focus as we talk about all of this. What are we watching here?
Well, you know, that's there's a couple of pieces, right? I think the biggest one right now, and I'll preface this by saying this is exactly why we put out the My Home program, because we know when the legislature wants to prioritize resources for things that they care about, there's an opportunity to do that. The single
Mhm.
biggest monetary component of the budget right now as it relates to housing is actually a new low income housing tax credit that has been proposed by the governor. Both chambers have different sets of bills on them. Both of those sets of bills are moving. Both have different dollar amounts within them, so that will ultimately have to be negotiated. But that is a program, and I'll just say a round number. Jen, feel free to jump in and correct me, but starts at around $50 million. I mean, again, there's differences between the two packages, But what's most important here is that number grows over time. And so we know that based on its growth over time and the commitment that the state would be making in that, they would also then have the ability to prioritize the My Home program if they wanted to. And so the excuse of saying we don't have resources in which to prioritize this for housing to fill that finance gap, we know just isn't accurate. So it gives us an opportunity to talk about this in a very different way. The only other thing I'd mention on housing was that within the roads deal, there was a codification of the ongoing $50 million for the Housing and Community Development Fund. We don't see that to be in jeopardy at all, and eventually we'll see that resource come in as well in this coming fiscal year.
Jen, I want to return to you for just a moment as we're sort of talking broadly about the topic of housing, whether that's legislation or how housing funding is worked into the budget. We did get a question in about the housing legislation from a member. In efforts to speak to my colleagues or gain public pressure to our legislators, one of the dialogues I come up against is the disbelief that these preemption bills will really do what we are saying they will, compared to the idea that we need housing. So, how bad can these bills be? Jen, I'm going to stop there and let you just talk generally about that. And then I know
Yeah.
that there are a couple other questions I may need to follow up on.
Well, first and foremost, I think that's where it's so important that municipalities are evaluating what the impacts would be to their individual community, so that they can explain to whoever they're talking to that right now they are doing X, Y, and Z. And if the preemption bills were to pass, A, B, and C would happen, or something would impact their infrastructure, because the preemption bills are really that centralization of land use authority at the state level. They're taking away that local decision making ability. So they're completely different. They both, the My Home program and the preemption bills, are focused on zoning reform, but completely different tactics on how to get there. And so somebody that wants to say they're just the same, one just needs money and one doesn't, is completely ignoring the issue at hand if they're talking about affordability. I don't know
Mhm.
if they want to rely on this macroeconomics, theory of over, supply drives down costs. Yes, we all know the textbooks say that. We would have to have such an oversaturation, though, of housing to actually have an impact where it starts to drive down costs. And there are things at play in the world of economics that wouldn't allow that to happen, because that would
Right.
start biting into other people's profits. And
Hmm.
so I really, that again, ask your local planning staff, planning and zoning staff, what the difference is. How do you already align with the My Home program? Maybe you would already qualify for the benefits of the My Home program if it were put into use, versus what would happen in your community and what would your community look like? What are the impacts on your infrastructure if the preemption bills were to pass? You being able to tell that story is the most beneficial and will have the biggest impact than any comparison we can do of the two.
Right.
Because we do, again, it's local decision making, local context versus that centralized authority at the local level. It's a demand for density versus a community, supported, appropriate housing growth tied to, again, what is your individual infrastructure capacity? And then when it comes down to it, say ADUs are permitted by right everywhere, because we get preempted on those. They're already allowed in communities. We're hearing from our members that already allow them. No one is building them because of the cost. So
Hmm.
zoning's not the problem. Again, it
Hmm.
comes back to that cost.
And can you speak to if any of the realtor associations are speaking out on any of these?
So we have had some individual conversations. I went down and participated in a meeting of a realtor board in Southeast Michigan, and they were very supportive of what we were doing, and actually were pushing back against why their state association was so heavily supporting preemption. Again, it's because those individual realtors, they know the communities they're working in and live in, and they know the context of what would and wouldn't help them in selling more homes and what's going on in those communities. So again, having your individual, talking to your individual chambers, your individual realtor groups, and if you're able to bring them on board, send them to the My Home page, have them sign up as supporters. We already have some developers and private organizations that are supporting the My Home program. I think that the more we can get, again, in showing united front, is just going to continue to push us past this preemption speak of. It's going to be this silver bullet that helps with housing being built and housing being affordable.
Thanks, Jen.
Emily, I'll add to, so
Sure.
much of this comes down to meeting the moment. And
Hmm.
one of the things that gets lost in this conversation is actually the work that the federal government is doing right now.
Hmm.
I think right now it is our understanding and expectation that you're going to see the Senate today, probably later this evening, pass the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. And it will probably only be a day or two later that the U.S. House passes that and sends that to the president for signature, which we fully anticipate he will be signing. It will be the single largest housing policy change we have made in decades in this country, and zero of it revolves around preemption. And what we have an opportunity to do here in Michigan, and if you look at kind of the side by side comparison of what the feds are doing and what Michigan is doing, in our opinion, or should be doing with the My Home program, they align almost directly. The idea of making sure that Michigan is aligned with federal policy so we can best leverage that is a huge advantage to us. So not only would we be leveraging, federal dollars potentially in this space, we could leverage state resources, and that allows us to meet the moment, which the moment is that there is a gap between what people can afford and what it costs to build. And if we don't tackle that issue immediately, we are not going to be able to tackle our housing crisis.
Thanks, Jen. All right, turning away from housing for a moment, another issue the league's been tracking, legislation related to video franchise fees. So first, let's just make sure we all are on the same page. What are video franchise fees and why do they matter to local governments, John?
Yeah, so video franchise fees are a payment that is made to local units of government by a video service provider for their right to be within the right of way. And so
Mhm.
these fees have been a source of revenue for a long time for local units of government. And quite frankly, I'm sure just about everybody on this call has seen that revenue source decline. Now, part of the reason which it is declining is because the market by which we provide, I'll say cable, has
Mhm.
changed, right? So from the
Right.
traditional cable, top box to streaming services. And streaming services now deliver a variety of different things. You can think about Netflix in its original version, doing a few shows and movies and things like that. Now all the way to YouTube TV and Hulu Live, providing you what looks like and operates like cable. And so there has been a debate in Lansing as to whether or not streamers should be charged a video franchise fee. Now, nobody in the state of Michigan is actually charging a video franchise fee for streaming. And so part of our engagement has really been to make sure that we protect the existing resources that we have for those that own hard infrastructure in the right of way. So it has been a pretty lengthy debate over several sessions right now.
Mhm.
The House did pass two pieces of legislation, 5123 and 5124 last week. 5123 is the one that exempts streamers from being charged a video franchise fee. And what we saw, right? Because while we are opposed to the legislation, what we saw is with some additional education, there were 15 less votes on this bill this year than there were last year when it passed the House. And then they were not successful in passing it in the Senate. So we're going to try to use that momentum that we have here as a way in which to continue to push back against this legislation, make sure that we protect the interest that we have within protecting the right of way and the value that's associated with it, and also find a way to have a broader conversation about modernizing our system in terms of how we actually look at the procurement of that service of video of a video service provider. So it'll be an interesting conversation as we move forward, but hopeful that we can continue to have the same momentum we had last year in the Senate in opposition to this.
Thanks so much, John. And thanks to Jen and the rest of the state and federal affairs team, Betsy, Harrisana, Dave, who are behind the scenes are not with us today. Before we wrap up, don't forget to check out Inside 208, our state and federal affairs blog. Whether you're looking for legislative updates, funding opportunities, grant information, property tax resources, or analysis of issues affecting local government, Inside 208 is one of the best ways to stay informed between our Live with the League sessions. And of course, mark your calendars for Convention 2026. We'll be in Traverse City October 7th through 9th, bringing together municipal leaders from across the state for education, networking, and conversations about the issues shaping our communities. Registration opens soon, and we hope you'll join us. With that, thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Live at the League. Have a great week.